So has this not been a week of all sunshine, warmers, and can't you just feel that spring energy and that sense of hope in the air? And of course, we're getting more and more people vaccinated. There's a good sense of hope on the horizon. And it's good for us to be here together in person, and also to all who are with us virtually. It's good to be able to have this technology be together here today. Now, if we could just work out our sound system, sometimes we'd be in perfect shape. Nonetheless, the Pharisees in this gospel story had sight, but they were really blind. We have sight, we have the sight of faith, and sometimes, however, we may feel temporarily blinded. The liturgy planning group for today's liturgy came up with some suggestions about today's readings, and two of them really hit home with me just recently. So there were two thoughts that they had that struck me. And the question was raised, what is our blindness? What's our blindness? And then there was the idea that was shared in the group, how God's work can shine forth from other people. And I just yesterday had a marvelous experience of both that I want to share with you. This is like a little bit of a personal confession, if you will, because the truth is that sometimes even priests, even people of deep faith, have those moments of temporary blindness, if you will. And so there's been a lot of things happening that have been ruminating in my mind. There's been a lot of people who have had losses and suffering in a variety of different ways. And I was reading a story just the other day. It's a year since the coronavirus started. It was a story about these two sisters who died just 9 days apart. I was preparing to be with the Whitell family for the funeral of Jeff just yesterday. Next week, that family is going to bury another son. They lost two sons within weeks of each other. And another family that I know shared something about a job loss and some other things. And so I woke up yesterday morning in bed, and the first thing that popped into my head was this phrase that it's a prayer from one of the great saints. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. And I said, today, if you can, send a sign. I got up and I went about my morning routine. I got my cup of coffee. I went over to my prayer space, and I was sitting quietly, just meditating, praying, having my coffee, and my cell phone went off, you know, the little thing that lets you know that you have a text. And I thought, I'm not going to answer it. You know, this is my prayer time. But you know how when that goes off, you just got to know what it's about? It was early in the morning, and I never thought I'd use my cell phone for part of a homily, but I'm going to today because I want to share this with you. Now I just have to find it. I had it all set up. And in the meantime, I've been getting all these texts. Okay. So I'm sitting there with this prayer in my mind. You know, God, help my unbelief today. Show me some sign. And my cell phone goes off, and it was a cousin of mine who is a deeply spiritual woman. And she said, Carl, I have to just show you this picture. Woo! The signs from God never cease. Okay. So it was this beautiful picture, and I wish I could get it up on the screen, but she had been out walking early in the morning yesterday, and I see the house there. Some of the lights are on in the house, and in the sky behind the house, it's kind of grayish, turning blue, but there were these beautiful pink clouds. You can't really see this, but what are the pink clouds in the shape of? Can you tell us? They're in the shape of a cross. That. I'll show you all later. It was absolutely beautiful. She took that picture from her house in the morning. Yeah, it's beautiful. And so she texted me and said, this morning, you can start your day off seeing God's presence. What a great reminder that God is always at your side. Peace, joy, and love for your day. Now, how did she know that I needed that? But she saw that picture, took it, and she sent it to me. And that was my sign. That was my sign. So I said to her, I'm losing my email here. Let me just read this to you real quick. So my response to my cousin was, wow, so beautiful and true. Today, lying in bed as I woke, I said, God, some days I wonder. Don't we all, some days? God, some days I wonder, send a sign. And you sent this, Debbie. Never doubt God is working in you. Thanks. So that was what happened just yesterday morning. And I couldn't help but to remember these questions that were raised at the planning session. What's our blindness? What keeps us sometimes for living in the light and seeing the light? And then the idea that was shared, how God's work shines forth from other people. And that simple thoughtfulness in the picture and the words of faith that she sent to me, that blindness was illuminated. God was very present, and God is always very present. So how does that fit in today with our gospel reading and the readings that we've just heard? Well, believing the man born blind could speak with any authority was not something that the Pharisees in today's story could wrap their minds around or trust. And so they chose not to accept what they were able to witness with their very eyes. They chose to remain blind to see the truth because it was easier to believe that they are the ones who had the perfect vision. But what they failed to realize is that we are all born in darkness. It's called original sin. It's the sin of Adam and Eve in the story of the scriptures, and it's the legacy that they give to us. It's how we understand the darkness and the brokenness of the world and faith. And so in the early Christian era, baptism was often called illumination. In baptism, the believer is illumined by the light of Christ. And it's this light of Christ received in baptism that illuminates our lives as we make our way through this life one day into the next. And yet, as I pointed out, even in my own life, sometimes there are those temporary moments of blindness and darkness. And so it's in this framework today that we hear these readings. We pray for our elect who will be called forward in just a moment to have a clearer vision of who Christ is and how the light of Christ can guide them, can guide us as light for the world. The question for us is, do we have the courage? And maybe that's what today's liturgy in Lent is about, reminding us again, do we have the courage to examine our hearts in the light of Christ and then turn away from all that blinds us to God's goodness and truth, despite the ongoing darkness? And so you see, I was temporarily blinded by some anxiety and some doubts until through a simple text message and an exchange of faith and a beautiful picture of how God's creation and God is present in that creation around us reminded me of how the light of God is always with us. It reminded me of this truth. God is always good. He gave us the gift of Jesus, the true source of light for our world, for our minds, our hearts, our souls. We just have to be careful not to temporarily be blinded by the darkness that still exists with the light.